Ukraine is asking NATO to shoot down Russian missiles, ratcheting up the risk of a direct confrontation. As Moscow says, American weapons have already crossed a Kremlin red line, which it previously said would trigger direct reprisals.
Kharkiv again, and this is a scene of yet. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting today with Western weapons and what they're used for in Ukraine, because that is the topic that has got both Kyiv and the Kremlin animated, and we can see why, because those weapons have made such a difference throughout the course of this war. There is some really dramatic footage at the moment of American ATACMS weapons, one of the newest missiles delivered by America to Ukraine, taking out a Russian S-400 battery. And the S-400 battery is one of Russia's most sophisticated, it is Russia's most sophisticated air defense battery. And what we can see is that a battery is being surveilled by a Ukrainian drone. So a drone is in the sky, seemingly undetected, watching this battery fire. It appears to exhaust its missiles. It is then struck by a volley of ATACMS missiles fitted, it would appear, with cluster munition warheads. At least 2, possibly 3 S-400 launchers are destroyed, as well as the radar it uses to detect incoming missiles and the command and control center. Now, this is just one vignette of the conflict shown to us through this drone feed, but nonetheless a salient reminder of how powerful these ATACMS missiles can be. Those same ATACMS missiles were used just last week in an attack on Sebastopol, the capital of Crimea, sinking, we understand, a Russian corvette. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been hammered by Ukraine often using some of its own developed sea drones like the Sea Baby and the Magura 4, but also with Western weapons. We've seen just recently with those ATACMS, and before that with the British supplied Storm Shadows and the French Scalp cruise missiles. Now, the discussion at the moment continues to be around whether these weapons are being allowed to hit targets on sovereign Russian soil. Ukraine has been attacking Russian soil. It wants to use Western weapons to attack targets on Russian soil. Now, Britain has signalled it has no objections. America has been more reticent, but actually the latest messaging from Secretary of State Antony Blinken is that while America does not support attacks with its weapons on Russian soil, he said that is a decision for Ukraine, so creating some ambiguity there. What Ukraine is asking for, what we understand President Zelensky is asking for, as well as wanting to be able to use these weapons to hit targets on Russian soil, is he wants NATO to shoot down Russian missiles, so for NATO to use its air defense capabilities to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory. Now, these are two slightly separate things. The reason Ukraine wants to be able to hit targets in Russia, particularly in areas like Kharkiv, is because you cannot only fight your enemy on the front line. Both sides are engaged in a conflict where they fight at the front line, where it's awful, where it's bloody, where it's trenches, it's horrific, but also much deeper, where they try and strike each other's logistics to degrade their ability to bring men and munitions, armour and material to the front. And in Kharkiv province, where Russia has launched its most recent offensive, the border, Kharkiv shares a border with Russia. Kharkiv city, Ukraine's second largest city, the outskirts of that city are just 15 miles from the Russian border. So if Ukraine is only allowed to strike up to that border, then it is fighting with one arm tied behind its back. And that is, Ukraine has been striking targets inside Russia, particularly with its own artillery, particularly with its own rocket artillery. It's also been using drones. We've seen them against the Kremlin, against airfields, but it wants to use Western weapons. And you might imagine that it wants to use things like, for example, the HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems with a range of about 70 miles, capable of hitting a target no bigger than a car, so accurate with a long range. Moscow has made it very clear that it would see the use of US weapons and indeed British weapons against targets on its soil as a direct escalation. And when we saw Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron signalling that Britain did not have an objection to this, and Defence Secretary echoing that message, Moscow announced nuclear drills. Now that was its attempt to send a clear warning. What we've heard today, surprisingly perhaps, is a message from Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, saying that American weapons, he believes American weapons, have already been used against targets in Russia. Now, he did not explicitly link that to the previous threats the Kremlin had made, but we have heard the Kremlin threats suggesting that were Western weapons used against Russian targets in Russia, then that would trigger reprisal strikes. And when they were talking about the UK, they said reprisal strikes against British bases in Ukraine. There are no British bases declared in Ukraine, and British bases outside Ukraine as well. So this is once again a fraught situation where Ukraine is asking for, seeking a capability which many would say is entirely justified, because remember, Russia is using weapons from Iran, weapons from North Korea, and we understand weapons from China to blitz targets right across Ukrainian territory. So why should Ukraine not be allowed to use weapons from its allies to strike back at its enemy? That is certainly the Ukrainian position. There remains a degree of ambiguity over exactly how Ukraine is using those weapons, how it's going to be allowed to use those weapons. And as ever, like before, we will continue to keep you updated on that subject. On the question of China, Britain's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said this week that he believed he said he was declassifying military intelligence from both the UK and the US, suggesting lethal aid was flowing from China to Russia. He considered it a significant development, and he said it sort of blew out of the water Beijing's previous claims to be a handbrake on Russia's invasion. Beijing has before tried to present itself as a moderating influence on Moscow, but what we've seen over the course of this conflict is ever closer ties between Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping. Beijing responded to those claims by denying them. Interestingly, America was also slightly reticent, suggesting that it was not aware that its intelligence had corroborated Grant Shapps' claims. If we're looking for reasons as to why Ukraine wants more help shooting down missiles, then we need look no further than Kharkiv. We've had our reporter Paul Sims has been in the city with photographer Peter Jordan and a Ukrainian colleague there this week. They were there when a massive Russian bombardment killed at least 7 people when it hit a printing facility. Bodies being pulled out of the rubble, horrific scenes really. That city continues to be under constant bombardment and of course fighting raging in the countryside just a few miles, 15 to 30 miles outside the city where Russia has launched that offensive from the north. Today, President Zelensky is in the city. The fact that he's there is a sign that things appear to be stabilizing, and indeed the head of Ukraine's armed forces has said that Russia's offensive appears to have got bogged down. It appears to have stalled. Russia claiming it wanted a buffer zone. Other military analysts, who I would agree with, suggesting that this was partly a diversion, an attempt to stretch Ukraine's forces because Russia continues to attack heavily and ferociously in the eastern Donbass region, around places like Bakhmut, which you'll remember from earlier on in the war, and Chasiv Yar, the next town in the line which Ukraine is holding. Quickly, we'll look at what's going on in Moscow. The purges of the Ministry of Defense continue after President Vladimir Putin secured his most recent term in office. He sacked his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, a long-time political ally, someone who was seen as very close to Putin. So his removal suggesting that the FSB is winning a battle. So the intelligence service is winning a battle for control and influence in the Kremlin against the Ministry of Defense. And since Shoigu was removed, another 5 senior officials from the Ministry of Defense have been arrested or charged, including the Deputy Defence Minister Timur Ivanov, the most senior, and most recently a Lieutenant General Vadim Shagarin. That appears to be perhaps an attempt to clear out or at least pin the blame for the way the conflict in Ukraine has gone on those officials within the Ministry of Defence. Officially, the Kremlin says this is just an attempt to root out corruption. It appears to be broader than that. It appears to be evidence of a Kremlin power struggle, which the Ministry of Defence and Sergei Shoigu's acolytes are losing. A few questions from last week. One is, will Ukraine be able to raise enough men and financial support to win? Well, it's a really good question because ultimately whether Ukraine can endure and roll back the Russian invasion will all come down to exactly those two things: financial resources and human resources. And both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are locked in this conflict of attrition, and the winner will be the one that can sustain that supply of men and material for the longest. And because Ukraine is relying on its Western allies for the military materiel, ultimately one of the greatest risks for Ukraine is the resolve of its Western allies. And we have seen that resolve stretched. We're seeing Hungary expressing its reluctance to be involved in long-term NATO planning to support Ukraine. But at the same time, we're seeing NATO deliberately trying to take steps to cement its support for the long term. And that is a way of NATO trying to future-proof itself against political upheavals that may or may not take place across its member states. And part of that is trying to future-proof itself against a possible Donald Trump presidency in America, because he has said he would end the war in a day, but there is fear that the way he would do that is by forcing Ukraine to capitulate. The second part of that question is just as difficult. It's whether or not Ukraine can generate the manpower. Men and women are fighting across the front line, but whether it can generate enough trained and equipped soldiers to keep fighting Russia. Both sides have suffered spectacularly heavy losses. Russian losses would appear to be significantly higher, but they're bad on both sides. This has been a very bloody and brutal conflict. Russia has shown historically and is showing now its ability to endure pain, to soak up casualties. Somebody this week described the Russian attitude to enduring that suffering as almost bovine. Ukraine has tried harder to shield its armed forces from those sorts of losses by not using the same sort of human wave tactics of just throwing men into the meat grinders up against machine guns. But nonetheless, there is a growing chorus calls among Ukraine's supporters, a sense of urgency that it needs to find a way of replacing the soldiers it is losing on the battlefield. Its allies, Britain, are trying to train civilians through Operation Interflex. There are similar organisations, similar initiatives inside Ukraine, but there are suggestions, indeed Ukraine's parliament and Zelensky have talked about new waves of mobilisation and conscription. It's controversial, it's very difficult for Ukraine, but nonetheless, it is going to have to raise more soldiers if it's going to continue to hold off or to stall, and if it has the Russian invasion, and if it's to have any hope of rolling it back. Final question today is, why haven't there been more attempts on President Putin's life? It's a good question. We know that there have been attempts on President Zelensky's life because he's told us about them. Indeed, that's one of the things he spoke to me about when I interviewed him at the end of last year. We asked him whether or not, given the chance, he would make an attempt on President Putin's life. And interestingly, it was the only question in our hour-long interview where actually he gave a sort of politician's answer. He didn't answer it directly, but he just said that Ukraine had the right to defend itself in any way possible. I think signalling that if they did have the chance, it is an opportunity they would try to take. We don't know whether there have been attempts on President Putin's life. We know that he is surrounded by incredibly tight security. It's worth remembering, though, the attempted coup by the Wagner mercenaries. When Yevgeny Prigozhin drove his mercenary army towards Moscow, spreading panic that the Kremlin that Putin could be toppled by force. Now that fizzled out, but it was a sign, it gave us an insight into perhaps some of the anger within Russia, sort of even within Russia's highly nationalist quarters who support the war in Ukraine, that they may have wanted to replace Putin by force. Clearly, a man like Vladimir Putin, surrounded by the security that he has, would be an incredibly difficult man to kill. Thank you for listening. As ever, if you've got any questions and you're watching on YouTube, please do ask them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer some of them next week.